Hey friends, I'm Sam Cody, and today I'm going to be giving you my tips and recommendations for getting back into reading fantasy. If you know me, you know I love reading fantasy, and I've only been back into reading for about a year and a half, so it's still fresh on my mind what it feels like to be at a loss for where to start and how to get back into reading. But before I get into giving my recommendations for books that I think are good starting points for reading fantasy, I want to give you some advice that is fantasy specific. So there's plenty of general reading advice that I could give you, but for fantasy in particular, I think that this advice applies especially well. Start small or start excited. Pretty much everyone has a different opinion as to where someone should start reading fantasy. Usually they have some book or some series in mind. Lord of the Rings is a really common series that gets brought up in these kinds of conversations, so I'll just use that as an example. If you're absolutely psyched to start reading something like Lord of the Rings and are just like very fueled and excited by getting started on something like that, something that's big, something that's immersive, by all means, do that. You should listen to that intuition and do exactly what you want to do. Follow the fun, and it can be a lot of fun to dive straight into something really big. After all, that's what I did. I read The Way of Kings after not reading fantasy for a long time, just because it really, really excited me. There was probably a 2 or 3 month gap between when I first learned about The Way of Kings and got really, really excited about it, and the excitement built and built, and then I finally read it. Even though I probably technically wasn't ready for it, I just loved it because I was so excited for it. All of the sort of fear and anxiety about reading a gigantic book was out the window because of how excited I was. So if you're excited enough, it doesn't really matter how big the book is. On the other hand, if you don't have a book that's necessarily calling your name like this one did for me, or like Lord of the Rings or something else, I think you'll thank yourself for starting pretty small. So I'm talking about standalone novels, shorter books, things that will give you a good primer to be able to handle some of the more dense literature in the future if that's what you want to do. There's absolutely no reason to bog yourself down in a gigantic project when you could be reading a couple short, fast, fun books to get yourself started and get yourself back into that reading habit. If the excitement isn't enough to get you over the sheer page count, then building up to that and lessening your fear through exposure is a good idea. Without further ado, here are my recommendations for fantasy books for beginners and how they'll train you to tackle the bigger beasts in the future. So one thing that a lot of fantasy series have are multiple POVs. This means that you'll probably be receiving a story from the perspective of any number of different protagonists. So rather than having like one character like Harry Potter that we follow all the way through, you might have, a bunch of characters and you get to see into their minds in a chapter that's about them, but then the next chapter it might be following a completely different character. It sounds confusing. It definitely can be daunting, but when it's done well, it's usually very easy to follow and quite manageable. So a book that I recommend to get yourself used to this and try out a multiple POV fantasy is Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. So this is my absolute favorite fantasy book to recommend to beginners. This book literally has it all. It has great characters. It has a great plot that drives the story. It has a great magic system and fantastic world building that doesn't try to overextend itself. It does all of that without overwhelming readers with too complex of a plot or too many character names to remember. That isn't to say that it's been dumbed down or anything like that. This is still a complex, interesting, fascinating book, in my opinion. It'll give you a taste of what giant epic fantasy series are like without all of the headache that can come with that. This will be a lot quicker and a lot easier to devour. A great one to start with if you want to try multiple POV fantasy. Next one. If you're wondering what fantasy classics are like, I think you should check out The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. So I mentioned before The Lord of the Rings. That's kind of that's the one that everyone points to as the classic. So far, I've only read The Fellowship of the Ring out of The Lord of the Rings, and I definitely think that The Hobbit is a better one to start with. First of all, it comes chronologically before The Lord of the Rings within that world, and second of all, it's written for kids. It has all of that fantastic, awe and world building that Middle-earth is known for, but it knows that its readers aren't there for the world building. Its readers are there for the story. I found that while I was reading this, I was pretty much always interested in what was happening, and I felt like the story was moving along at a steady pace, whereas with The Lord of the Rings, that's one major complaint, is that it goes really slow. This one knows that its audience hasn't read much fantasy before, maybe hasn't even read much before. You still get all of Tolkien's great writing style and just deep world and lore without being overwhelming. So this is a really good one to dip your toe into and try out. I say dip your toe into it, but it doesn't feel like that. It still feels like you're getting deep into something big, but without the page count commitment. The Hobbit's definitely a good one to look into if you want to know what a fantasy classic is like. This is a mess. I don't know what I'm doing with these books. So one subgenre of fantasy that I'm not even sure if I'd call it a subgenre. It's just a format of fantasy that is really common. Is questing fantasy, and it's something that you'll run into in just so many fantasy series. Some people love it, some people hate it. When it's really well done, it's what fantasy is known for. Think Dungeons and Dragons. Questing fantasy is typically defined by a small group of protagonists that are going on an adventure, and that adventure involves a lot of smaller adversities that they have to overcome, problems they have to solve, quests they have to complete in order to eventually solve the main conflict of the book. I do think it's important to get a taste of, and if you're looking for an easy way to do that, the Percy Jackson series. So I really wish I read these as an elementary schooler or a middle schooler back when I was around the age of the protagonists. Alas, I'm reading them for the first time now. I just read the second one a couple weeks ago, but I think that these are fantastic examples of questing fantasy. They're fast, they're lighthearted, and even though I didn't read them as a kid, they're still somehow nostalgic for me. But essentially, we follow a group of kids as they complete quest after quest as part of a larger quest, sort of like I was describing. This is definitely a standout example within the subgenre of questing fantasy, in my opinion. Can I move these? I'll move. One term you might have heard tossed around on BookTube or Book Talk or wherever you talk about books is character versus plot driven stories. And a lot of the ones that I've talked about so far have been plot driven, meaning that there is a conflict and the story revolves around the conflict and how it's getting solved. But oftentimes there will be character driven stories. This happens in all genres to some level. It's not something that's limited to fantasy at all, so maybe you've read some of this before. But if you're looking for a good example in a fantasy/sci-fi setting, definitely check out All Systems Red by Martha Wells. This is definitely, I would say, sci-fi, but it uses a lot of the same mechanics as the fantasy books that I've mentioned here. It's very cross-relevant, and sci-fi and fantasy have very blurry lines between them anyways, I love Murderbot. That's the protagonist of this book. Martha Wells just does such a great job fleshing out this character in this short novella. This is also the first novella in the Murderbot Diaries series, and you can also read this as a standalone. You don't have to pick up the whole series just because you read this one. So if you're looking for something that is a great example of a character-driven story within sci-fi fantasy, definitely check this out. And last but not least, if you're wondering what hard magic systems are like, check out Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. If you couldn't tell, I'm a big Brandon Sanderson fan. I think he does a lot of stuff really well. And one thing that's really common in a lot of modern fantasy is hard magic system. A hard magic system refers to a magic system where its limitations and capabilities are pretty clearly defined and mostly known to the reader. In Mistborn, there's a magic system called Allomancy, in which people can ingest different types of metals, which they burn within them to gain different magical abilities. So it's really cool to see them use this magic to solve problems and get out of tricky situations and attempt a massive heist using magic. It's so freaking cool, and it uses the magic system super well. If you want a taste of what hard magic is like, Mistborn is definitely one to check out. This is the first book in a trilogy, the Mistborn trilogy. I definitely do recommend reading the whole trilogy, but you can also just read the first one if you're not trying to get into a whole series. If you've watched this far, thank you so much. It really means the world to me that people watch these all the way through. If you'd like to stay in touch and get in touch with some members of this community. The link to the Discord is down in the description. I highly recommend you check it out. We've had some nice chats over there about like annotation styles and types of music we like to listen to when we read, all sorts of stuff like that. So feel free to check that out. I've also got a link to my Patreon down below. And once we hit 15 $1 patrons, we're going to start the book club, which I'm super excited about. And I hope you are too. So if you'd like to support me over there, the link is in the description. Thank you all again for watching. Until next time, see ya.